Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
There are 150 psalms in the book of Tehillim, the book of Psalms. It's, named for what it is. A large proportion of them are written by the greatest single poet, songwriter in Jewish history, who also in his spare time was a king. David HaMelech, King David, is a contributor to the largest single body of work throughout the book of Psalms. But if you pay attention very, very carefully, the attribution to David changes from time to time. The introduction line. For example, in the psalm that we sang tonight, Psalm 29, as the conclusion to the weekday version of Kabbalat Shabbat, it begins with the phrase, Mizmor LeDavid, Mizmor LeDavid. It is a song for David. Whereas other psalms, such as the one that we recite for the returning of the Torah when it is a weekday, is LeDavid Mizmor. For David, a song. It's basically the same thing. But nothing is ever the same thing if it is different in Judaism. That's the point. When you have an infinite vocabulary of an infinite creator, as the author, of course, is inspiring those that write, that any word choice is a choice. And any choice that God chose to make is worthy of our investigation. So it should not come as a surprise to any of you that our sages investigate why and what does it mean that sometimes it's Mizmor LeDavid and sometimes it's LeDavid Mizmor. And they came to a very interesting conclusion. They said, imagine that you are David. Imagine you are sometimes inspired, welling up within you to write a beautiful song about God. For you, you will then have this song. It is a song that came from you. Right? It is a Mizmor LeDavid. It is from you and it pours out. On the other hand, imagine you are sometimes David and you are not in the composing mood. You are not able to come up with anything. Nothing is inspiring you at this moment. You're just sort of chilling out, doing your kingly things, or maybe in the early days, hanging out with the flock. But then, says the sages, what David would do is he would hang his harp on a peg open to the window. And the wind would blow through the window and across the strings, and David would hear a new melody. And that melody would then be inspiring him to write the song that would go with it. Sometimes the song came from within him, and sometimes the song came from outside to him. And thus we have the two different versions. Sometimes a song of David, sometimes a song for David. Both are his songs, but each one represents a different direction of inspiration. In this week's Torah portion, we see something that mirrors this quite closely. In this week's Torah portion, we meet a man by the name of Bilam. And Bilam is famous because he is the most prolific non-Jewish prophet in the entire Tanakh. We hear about a few other people here and there, but as having the actual words of a non-Jewish prophet, that is rather unusual. And for Bilam to fill up multiple chapters and pages, indeed even to give us one of our most famous Jewish phrases, Ma tovu ohalecha, how wonderful are the tents of Jacob, the dwelling places of Yaakov, or of Israel, the dwelling places of Jacob. This is something special. But how did Bilam come to know what God wanted? Was it like Moses? Moses for whom Vayikra, God would call out and Moses would come? Or was there a different type of experience? Roughly put, was Bilam on a first-name basis with God the same way Moses was? And the verbiage that's used in this section of the Torah tells us no. It was not quite the same. Instead of Vayikra, God calling out to Moses, it was Vayikar. It happened. Occasionally, as Bilam even himself admits, occasionally God will bump into him, or more likely, he will bump into God. There will be an encounter, and from that encounter he will be inspired, and from that inspiration the words will then come out. And thus we find in this section, he can prepare himself, he can hope for the encounter, but it's not like Moses. There is no obvious conduit between the two. And indeed, both with the writings of David and the distinction between Moses and Bilam, we can see a pattern for ourselves of how to relate, how to connect to the divine. Now granted, none of us are Moses. The Torah is explicit that there's no one like Moses. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from both patterns of Moses and Bilam. Sometimes there are moments where we need to experience the divine. We need to reach out to God. We need inspiration. We need strength. And we can consciously, willingly try to put ourselves into that position to have that experience. We don't always, as my great teacher Rabbi Dorff would say, hit a home run. You don't always feel that overflowing experience of spirituality. But by having reached out intentionally and having reached out firmly and strongly, you can at least have some of an experience, some feeling of strength, of comfort, of perhaps illumination. Never as much as we want, of course. We are but human, but some connection. On the other hand, sometimes we can be going along minding our own business, just walking through life as we are more commonly doing, when something will happen. There will be an experience that grabs our attention. There will be an occasion, a glimpse, a flash that pulls us towards the divine, that demands that we stop our mundane task and consider that which is spiritual. Both are essential. If we go through life only thinking that we can experience God only on our terms whenever we make time, whenever we are structured for it, then we miss those opportunities of serendipity when the divine comes happening along to disturb us, to shake us from our mundane complacency. On the other hand, if we only wait for happenstance, if we just wait to bump into God, then we can oftentimes go for a very long time without that experience. Indeed, we might feel that we never have that experience because only waiting for it to happen to us means we may not even be attuned to it. It would be like David sitting with the harp strumming in the wind and closing the window because it's making such a racket, rather than listening attentively to what that wind may be teaching. We have to be open to both forms of experience, both the structure, as we might find it in the Siddur through formal study, as well as the spontaneous, what we will find just by observing the world around us and allowing ourselves to be moved by inspiration in the moment. Both elements create a complete connection to God. Both elements fuel our spirituality. Both elements are essential. And thus it should come as no surprise that even though Bilam did not get what he wanted, what he did was still recorded so that we could learn from that experience. Shabbat Shalom.